Centuries ago, Wales was a warrior country, fighting against the English for its independence. Few braved its wild and dangerous frontiers. The battle will be won or lost by the brilliance of two rival princes and, above all, the strength of their castles. "700 years ago, Harlech Castle stood on the edge of the known world, but was at the forefront, at the very cutting edge of military design. It's a masterpiece of engineering, a perfect fighting machine that must have struck terror into the hearts of many a medieval warrior. And for one vital moment in history, Harlech was the most invincible fortress in the world." One of my earliest architectural memories, I suppose dating back, gosh, many, many years now, when I was 4, 5 or 6, was being given a wonderful present. And incredibly, here it is, the castle I was given, and in bits. And this castle was Harlech Castle. Back then, I didn't appreciate how accurate this was, but it's perfect in almost every detail. That goes there, doesn't it? The wall walk on the Great Hall with sand. And lastly, and again for me, strangely evocative, the drawbridge. It goes on there. Oh, Triangle. The name on the drawbridge. And then, of course, having got this castle in miniature, age 4 or 5, I came to see the real thing soon after. And it's haunted me as an image of architecture from that day till this. Set in the north of Wales, Harlech's story is both violent and terrible. Harlech Castle was born out of a bitter conflict between two royal princes. On the one hand, there was Edward Longshanks, Plantagenet, King of England, and on the other, Llewellyn ap Griffith of the Royal House of Gwynedd, the Prince of Wales. The battle between these two men, one arrogant and aggressive, the other cunning and obstinate, came to define modern Britain, and this was to be a battle to the death. Both princes were inspired soldiers. Edward wanted to crush the Welsh and bring them under English rule. Llewellyn was fighting for an independent Wales. Neither prince could be sure of victory. The outcome would determine the fate of two nations. In medieval times, the boundary between England and Wales was fluid. The English were constantly trying to push the Welsh back into their heartlands, while the Welsh were trying to push the frontier back into the borderlands of the English barons. Both royal princes knew that castles held the key to power over the land. But whilst Llewellyn already had strongholds in Wales, Edward would have to build new fortresses to stake his claim. Harlech Castle would be the linchpin of Edward's military strategy to smash the Welsh. For the first time in history, the most radical elements of castle design came together in one building. Harlech combined a fantastic defensive location on a high rock with a revolutionary twin-towered gatehouse. It had round towers rather than square ones. And, instead of a keep, Harlech derived its military strength from a series of great concentric walls. Even today, it has a forbidding power that still speaks of English aggression and intimidation. Harlech is no silent ruin. True, it doesn't look quite as it did when in its prime, but the essential structure's still there. All that's missing is the castle's war paint and its timber interior structure. And another thing that's missing is the sea. 700 years ago, the Irish Sea came right up to the base of the rock on which the castle stands. For me, this is the most impressive military structure in Britain. It has an elemental quality, with its well-calculated geometrical forms being constructed of the same rough, rude rock on which they stand. Absolutely terrific. Here we have man-made beauty emerging out of sublime nature. But here, this is beauty with a very dark and violent purpose. The 13th century was an age of chivalry. Both warriors were handsome men. Edward was noted for his height and nicknamed Longshanks, while Llewellyn was said to rouse a magnetic loyalty from his men on the battlefield. Yet both princes were capable of extreme cruelty. When Edward was a young man, a contemporary chronicler wrote in despair about his potential as a king. He described a particularly unpleasant and unprovoked attack by Edward.
As he was passing through a peaceful part of the country, a young man met him, and Edward, without any pretext for killing or maiming the young man, ordered one of his ears to be cut off and one of his eyes to be pulled out, which was done, though contrary to every rule of justice. If he does these things when the tree is green, what can be hoped for when it is old and dry?
Worries about the volatile nature of the king were clearly justified. But what provoked these acts of extreme violence? As a young man, Edward had seen his father, Henry III, stripped of power by his own barons in a bloody civil war. Edward was not about to make the same mistakes as his father. He refused to accept any challenges to his authority. But he hadn't bargained on being crossed by Llewellyn. He saw the Welsh prince more as a local baron who owed him homage. Llewellyn was equally determined to defend his royal rights tooth and nail. As a young man, he too had eradicated anyone who threatened his royal power, even his own family. Llewellyn had his brothers removed. Owain was locked up in a dungeon, and Rhodri was put under house arrest. With such unrivaled power, Llewellyn was not about to bow to the rule of an English king. In a letter to the Archbishop of Canterbury, he complained bitterly about how the Welsh were treated by the English.
The people of Snowdon refused to do homage to any foreigner of whose language, customs and law they were ignorant. The people preferred to die rather than to live under English rule.
Llewellyn ap Griffith was, and remains, a hero of Welsh independence, a mythic figure. He didn't rule all of what we now know as Wales, but what he did rule, he ruled as a Welsh prince. But Edward insisted the Welsh prince owed him homage. In 1275, Edward organised a large-scale public ceremony. He took the entire court to Chester so everyone could watch Llywelyn kneel before him. But Llywelyn didn't show up, and so dealt a mighty blow to Edward's dignity. The slide into war was inevitable. On November the 12th, 1276, Edward proclaimed Llywelyn a rebel and an outlaw. The Welsh struggle for survival and the English fight for supremacy was about to begin. While Edward mustered his troops at Chester on the border, Llywelyn dug in the mountains of North Wales. This was Llewellyn's stronghold. He camped here with his small guerrilla army, and these were tough men indeed, men used to the very difficult terrain and to the harsh weather. We now know this as Snowdonia, a place of holidays, of peace and quiet. But then it was a very wild and dangerous land indeed, a land fought over, a frontier fought over by Englishmen and Welsh. But Edward was no fool. He refused to be lured into the mountains where the guerrilla tactics of Llewellyn's Welsh army could have won the day. Instead, Edward, with a vast force, cut a road through the high forests and marched on Flint. Effectively, Edward laid siege to the mountains and was resolved to starve Llewellyn out. Llewellyn's strategy of using the geography to his advantage simply didn't work. He underestimated disastrously the scale of the English armies. Edward's force was able to surround Llewellyn's stronghold completely. The outcome was inevitable, and Llewellyn was forced to surrender. He escaped with his life and resolved that never again would he make the same mistake. What had promised to be a monumental struggle was in fact over in a few weeks. Edward's first war against Llewellyn had been easily won, but it had cost him money and manpower. Now, Edward would make sure the Welsh never gave him trouble again. Edward's vision would turn out to be the most ambitious military and architectural master plan Britain had ever seen. He would build not one, not two, not even four, but 8 castles, strategically positioned in a circle with Harlech at the hub. It was, in effect, a ring of steel, or more accurately for the times, a ring of stone that would control and suppress the Welsh forever. And in the process, Edward rethought the entire strategy of castle building. Castles had been built on highlands in strong defensive positions. But now Edward would abandon his father's castles in the hills and reject the lofty sites of the old Welsh castles. He knew, although being on the top of a hill made a castle more defendable, it also made it easier to surround. Instead, he would take the risk of putting castles in the lowlands next to the sea. Llewellyn had retreated to Gwynedd in the north of Wales, where he still held undisputed power. Now Edward began to encircle Llewellyn, and in the next 5 years he built 4 of his new castles: Builth and Aberystwyth in the south, Rhuddlan and Flint in the north. As Edward surrounded Gwynedd, the united Wales that Llewellyn had been fighting for was effectively being broken into pieces. Llewellyn had to act fast and decisively if he was to reverse Edward's strategy. So he attacked the English again, and this time with much greater ferocity. Such was Edward's fury, he wrote to his army captain,
"Because of this outrageous assault on our men and this insult to our majesty, we give full authority and ultimate force to crush the Welsh with utmost speed. We want to put an end, finally, to the matter of putting down the malice of the Welsh."
Edward's first war against the Welsh was to punish Llywelyn. Now this second war was intended to annihilate Wales completely, imposing a final solution. When the English hit back, it was, even for these brutal times, a battle without conscience and of unparalleled cruelty. Welsh nobles, appealing to the Archbishop of Canterbury to intervene on their behalf, complained of the violence of Edward's men. They described appalling scenes of churches being burned and babies being slaughtered. This time, Edward's force was twice the size it had been before. He attacked on 3 fronts, driving Llywelyn deep into the mountains. The Welsh prince watched Edward's snare draw tighter. Once again, he escaped from Snowdonia, this time to open a second front on the southern border between England and Wales. But the English pursued Llywelyn to Builth in the heart of Wales. On the 11th of December, 1282, the fate of the 2 princes would be decided forever. It happened just about here. Llywelyn, with a company of Welsh soldiers, were ambushed by an English force. You can imagine the terror, the horror. The English up there, firing down with their bows and arrows. Here, the Welsh trapped, screaming. Then the English tear down the hill, swords thrashing around. It's a skirmish, a small battle. An English knight, Stephen de Frankton, runs his lance right through the body of Llywelyn. Llywelyn's on the floor, pinned to the floor, screaming. Another Englishman, Robert Body, comes up and cuts off Llywelyn's head. The Prince of Wales is dead. Llywelyn's head was sent to Edward, who had it displayed on a spike. Now Edward was determined to exterminate Wales's royal line forever. He killed Llywelyn's brother Dafydd, sent his daughter to a nunnery, and locked up his wife. But Edward didn't know about one other distant branch of the Llywelyn family, and one day it would come back to haunt him. Edward confiscated all the remaining land in the northwest for himself and set about completing his master plan. Now he built castles at Conway, Carnarvon and Harlech to secure his hold on Wales forever. These castles were both more deadly and more sophisticated than the last. They were to be outposts of empire as well as machines of repression. Edward did not intend to hold Wales merely by force of arms. He wanted to place it in economic shackles, to colonise it, to change its very nature. His earlier castles had really been landing strips to bring in English troops to put down rebellions. Now, at Conway, he built not only a castle, but a town. And these towns were to be well organised and fortified English towns. These new fortified towns were a bold attempt to make the outposts of Englishness self-sufficient. With a prosperous town on the doorstep, a garrison could be kept supplied with food, wine and other essentials throughout the year. English settlers were encouraged by the granting of rights and privileges. Quickly, these towns became bastions of English administration and order. The Welsh could enter these towns, but they were treated by the English with deep suspicion. They couldn't trade here, they couldn't live within the walls, they couldn't carry weapons in the town, and they had to be out by nightfall. They were, in effect, treated as second-class citizens in their own land. This was a type of apartheid. Carnarvon too had a fortified town, but here Edward's aim was more about show than military strategy. Carnarvon was more symbol than castle, more royal residence than fortress. Indeed, it's almost Disney-esque in its theatricality. But if Carnarvon was a showpiece and Conway a fortified town, Harlech would be the ultimate fighting machine. Harlech's location on the coast was crucial for its success. While Edward controlled the waters around Wales, the castle's resupply by sea could be guaranteed. Food and weapons could be brought by ships to the rear of the castle, escaping any attacks on the supply routes on land. And as we've already seen, the sea has retreated half a mile over the intervening centuries. Back in Edward's time, the castle sat right on the coast, with the gate at the water's edge. But the Watergate also made the castle vulnerable because it offered attackers a very tempting route of entry. If they got through the gate over there, they would find themselves on this staircase leading straight to the castle itself. But the staircase is hemmed in by the wall here and the castle rock itself. It's a very small space, a space controlled by the castle. So the attackers would find themselves in a trap, in a killing ground. The real defence was here, at the upper gate. This was small, but very well planned, very strong. It had a tower with arrow sloops, a battlemented wall walk. It had a drawbridge over a ditch, and it had this very difficultly planned dogleg approach. So the attackers that got here would arrive here and find themselves robbed of the impetus of attack, confused, and also showered with missiles from the tower above the gate and from the main towers of the castle itself. But the Watergate was only the rear entrance to the castle. The most vulnerable part of the fortress was always its main entrance point. Where the garrison could enter, so could the enemy. The answer was architecture. Make the potentially weakest place strongest through design. To get here, attackers would have rushed across the drawbridge over there, and then they would battle their way through this gate to get into the outer ward of the castle. Then they're confronted by the castle's true strength in a way, the mighty gatehouse. Now they have to deal with defence in depth. First of all, the great oaken door is closed here against them. That's barred with great timber posts going from here to that hole over there. And then they get through that. They find a portcullis crashed down against them. They get through that, and they find another portcullis. Here's the groove. Gosh. Now, if the attackers got through these, they'd find themselves in this terrifying, frightful chamber. It would have had murder holes in the stone vault, holes through which the defenders would drop molten oil or missiles. Death and slaughter, horror. So, you see, it's very hard to imagine any attackers battling their way through this mighty gatehouse. Even the position of the chapel of the gatehouse was part of a clever defensive plan. Now, there's the chapel window up there, lovely pointed lancet window. That looks east, but also it looks towards the outside. So anybody attacking the gatehouse would also essentially be attacking the chapel. Therefore, they'd be committing blasphemy, putting God on the side of the defenders. And it wasn't just the exterior window which doubled as part of the defensive machine. Looking inside the remains of the chapel, we can see how it worked as part of the fortress. I just crawled into the chapel, and this is still a very powerful and evocative space, mostly because it still has its floor and its little window with a lovely ornamented top. This little room here was like a vestry, I suppose, or a watching chamber. So the grandees of the castle, or indeed the king, if he was here, could have sat looking through his window at the altar, contemplating in quiet meditation his, well, no doubt, his Welsh campaigns. Incredible thought, isn't it? And here, look, a little vessel for holy water. But I can see, looking down, grooves here of the two portcullises. So when the portcullises were up, this chapel would have a portcullis right in front of the altar over there, another over there in front of the door. Amazing. So though a place of prayer, ultimately this chapel was a place of war.
There were military secrets and hidden uses within all the rooms of the castle, even the royal chambers.
Now here's the Queen's bedchamber right in front of me. And leading off it is this curious back passage. But what can its purpose be? Very odd. It's cut within the thickness of the wall, a large space. And here, here's a garderobe, a lavatory, shooting right down. So I suppose maybe that's what this is, like a sort of lavatory whole thing. But yet it's very big, and it goes on down into a little chamber, a little cell. And gosh, now here's the clue. There's a great hole in the floor. So this probably was another lavatory, another generous one. But this hole's very large indeed. One looks down and sees various shafts connecting. I just wonder whether this was a sort of secret passage, a lavatory indeed, but could double up as a bolt hole for use in emergencies. But in that case, where on earth does it lead? Well, if the Queen slid down this shaft, then she and her royal jewels would have ended up in the cesspit. Not too clever, perhaps, but no doubt a fate better than to fall into the hands of the Welsh.
Edward's castle reveals many secrets of the science of military engineering. Its defensive purpose had to be designed into every part of the machine.
Little details like this are intriguing, very thoughtful. See here, the threshold of the door is set higher than the ground level outside, making it very hard for attackers to force their way inside.
A castle was only as strong as its weakest point. All could come to nothing if one detail was got wrong. But at Harlech, the castle worked as a positive, active tool in the hands of the defenders. This meant that the castle fights with you and could be defended by a very small garrison. Some areas could even be held by just a single defender.
This staircase was very important because it's one of the few routes connecting the ground level of the castle with a high-level wall walk up there. Now, we're designed to be defended by one man. I'll show you what I mean. One right-handed swordsman here, a defender, has ample room to bring his sword down with great force on the attackers below him, inflicting frightful wounds with his broadsword. But the attackers, on the other hand, are at a grave disadvantage. They, again, right-handed swordsmen, can't bring their swords around. They're obstructed by the actual fabric of the staircase. They're sort of cower here, receiving blows from above. Not much they can do in self-defense. So this is a credible example, really, of a design which gives huge advantage to the defender. And even if the attackers get here on the wall walk, they're still, well, in great danger and a long way from taking the castle, because these towers, each one is like a little castle by itself, a little keep, a little strong point. There's no way in. So the attackers gather here, wondering what to do. All the time, the defenders up there. So the attackers look, and they edge their way around, trying to find a door this side. And of course, this constricted space means they're channeled into this frightful killing zone right here, with the chaps up there throwing stones and so on. Massive slaughter, piles of bodies. They get round here, And horror of horror, there's no door. So the attackers are trapped, really. They now become the victims. This is defence in depth of a high order, absolutely ingenious design. Even if attackers got through the wall around the inner ward and penetrated to the heart of the castle itself, they'd find themselves under attack from sniper positions like this, located in the wall itself. And the rock on which Harlech stands made it impossible to dig under the foundations. There was no way you could bring down the castle through undermining, the classic means of defeating a castle at the time. So, if you couldn't undermine Harlech, could you go right over the top of the walls? And if the Welsh mounted such an attack, did Harlech still play to the strength of the defender? I wanted to put it to the test. Could I single-handedly hold the castle under full frontal attack? Giant scaling ladders were an established part of medieval warfare, but instead of a crossbow, I opted for a 21st century paint gun. So the castle has shown itself to be immune to direct assault. It can only be taken through treachery or by siege, with the garrison being starved out. So what is the secret to Harlech? How did this revolutionary fortification come to be built in the wilds of Wales? Astonishingly, Harlech owes its origins to events on the other side of the globe. The 13th century was the last great age of the Crusades, when the rulers of the Christian world fought to regain the Holy Land from the Islamic world. In the First Crusade, the Christians had taken Jerusalem and killed tens of thousands of Muslims in a horrific massacre. In the Second, the Muslim leader Saladin seized Jerusalem back. And so it went on for 200 years, sometimes the Muslim world gaining the upper hand, sometimes the Christians. Prince Edward was to join the 8th Crusade. Edward was clearly emotionally committed to a holy war in the East and wanted to prove himself in the great religious and military adventure of the age. So, in 1270, he set sail with a few picked knights for the Holy Land. And it was here that inspiration for Edward's castle building was born. While he was travelling, Edward saw the finest fortifications in the world, the Crusader castles, outposts of the Christian Empire built inside enemy territory. So, when it came to conquering the Welsh, Edward knew exactly what to do. And the most impressive castle that Edward knew on his travels was the Crac des Chevaliers. To explore Crac des Chevaliers is to encounter the most startling similarities with Harlech. It may be on the other side of the world from Wales, but Crack holds the key to Harlech. The long-forgotten designer of this fortified entrance passage was clearly an engineer of genius. He understood the psychological as well as the military aspects of warfare. Imagine you're an attacker. You've got to cross the moat, over the drawbridge, smashed your way through the gate down there, and now struggling uphill. It's dark, very constrained space. Above you, holes, murder holes, boiling oil, missiles, arrows coming down. And this is just the beginning of the ordeal for the attackers. Crac des Chevaliers was home to the Knights Hospitallers, who Edward knew well. The first design feature he copied from their work was to transform the castle entrance, usually a weak spot, into the strongest point of all. The depleted ranks of the attackers now reach a sort of landing, and here they have to make a fateful decision, because the passage they've been coming up takes a hairpin bend. It goes up here, but do they go up there to the castle proper? I don't think so. Look at it. Even more constricted, much more terrifying. Really the theatre of death. More likely to make a bolt in this direction. Once again, as at Harlech, we see the castle fighting for the defenders and making victims of the aggressors. The attackers would find themselves trapped in this terrible sort of killing ground between the outer and inner defences. And here, they'd be bombarded from above, missiles and rocks from those windows and arrow slits up there. They'd be forced to retreat back through the arch. So the attackers would have to struggle up the narrow passage, and we can see, like Harlech, the ingenious use of restricted areas into which they would be funneled, trapped and slaughtered. If any attackers survived to get this far, they'd have found themselves confronted by a portcullis dropped in this groove here and a massive gate. They'd have been bunched on these steps, and here, again, they would have been attacked from above. This whole passageway is a masterful example of the art of defence in depth. Despite years of turmoil and catastrophe for the Christians, the Crac stood firm. It continued to command the routes inland from the sea and held the Christian frontier against Muslim attack. It became the key to the continued Christian presence in the Holy Land. It became a symbol, really, of Christian military prowess. But despite its huge strength, Crac des Chevaliers had one great weakness. All the water in the castle was supplied from the surrounding hills along an aqueduct. If the aqueduct was blocked, the garrison would run out of water, and ultimately the castle would fall. And while Edward was in the Holy Land, this is exactly what happened. In 1271, Sultan Baber was victorious, and Crac des Chevaliers fell into Muslim hands. The fall of Crac des Chevaliers sent a shiver through the Christian world because it seemed to mark the end of the Crusader adventure. The fall of the castle also revealed that no castle, no matter how high and mighty, could survive isolated inland in a hostile terrain where supply would be a great difficulty. Now, one man who learnt this lesson very well indeed was King Edward. So this is the real reason Edward had so boldly positioned his Welsh castles right by the sea. On the coast, any blockade of supplies would be impossible to maintain. Edward had taken both the strengths and weaknesses of Crac des Chevaliers to inform his design for Harlech. And while inspiration for Edward's castle building came from the Crusader castles, it was on his way home that he met the man who had masterminded their construction. Crossing the Alps, Edward stayed in Savoy, where he met the architect and master mason of the great Savoyard castles. His name was Master James of St. George, and he would become Edward's right-hand man in Wales. James was the fastest castle builder in the West. Speed would be essential to build in hostile Welsh territory. He was also adept at building on solid rock, even cliff faces. But as building work on Harlech got underway in the early months of 1283, even James found the Welsh terrain a daunting challenge. Here, on this quarry cliff face, you get some idea of the huge task facing the master mason at Harlech in transforming a terrifying rock into a sublime and magnificent fortress. The castle was built mostly using stones cut from the rock on which it stands, but some stones had to be brought in from elsewhere, including from this nearby quarry at Trevor. The question is, how do they quarry this stone? The answer is with great difficulty indeed. Everything was done by hand. 700 years ago, of course, the masons had no gunpowder, no explosives. They had to use a tool, something like this, called a plug and feathers. A mason would cut a hole in the face of the stone, then this would be inserted, and it worked rather like this. As the plug went down, the feathers would expand, splitting the rock. Incredible. And this rock is very hard indeed. It's amazing the castle got built at all. When fine or delicate details were needed, a different stone, a softer sandstone, had to be used, and this was brought all the way from England. Other materials needed for construction were also imported, such as timber, glass, and iron. And it wasn't just materials which had to be transported. The building operation involved thousands of labourers from all over England, England's French territories, and the rest of Europe. Edward's resources were vast. Meanwhile, Llywelyn's dream of a Wales belonging to the Welsh was diminishing with every stone laid. Heavy blocks of stone were either dragged on sleds or wheeled in carts. The method of lifting them off the ground and up to the level of the builders was particularly ingenious. At each site, carpenters constructed several windlass cranes, powered by men in a treadmill. High scaffolding was essential, but at Harlech, Master James used a new technique imported from Savoy. He employed spirals of scaffolding, allowing the stone and mortar to be carried up to the masons faster without having to climb up and down ladders. Square openings in the fabric, or putlog holes, survived, where the spiral scaffolding was put in place. It was an awe-inspiring task. Even by today's standards, Edward's castles are massive and difficult feats of engineering. The rubble walling of the castle was covered in lime render, and that was lime washed white. And here is an original piece surviving. Absolutely amazing. Now, the purpose of this was both psychological and practical. Imagine seeing this great white castle floating above the sea. It looked magical, amazing, absolutely invincible. But perhaps the most impressive thing about the building process was just how quick it was. Harlech was built at astonishing speed, from ground to battlements in just 6 years. It had to be quick. The remnants of Llywelyn's followers were in the hills, ready to ambush the builders at any opportunity. This was a very dangerous place for the English when building work started on the castle, and we know this because the castle itself holds the clue. Now, if you look at the tall wall in front of me, the wall to the inner ward, you can see about 15 feet up from the ground a horizontal line in the stonework. Now we can see from that the building site itself was fortified. The first thing that was done was to build a low wall quickly around the whole of the perimeter of the castle, so that the men inside, the garrison, the builders, would feel safe from attack. Fascinating.
The constant fear of attack by the Welsh led Master James to beg for more money to speed things up. He wrote to Edward,
"If our lord the king wants the work to be finished as quickly as it should be, and on the scale which it has been commenced, we could not make do with less than £250 a week. As to how things are in the lands of Wales, we still cannot be sure. As you know, Welshmen are Welshmen. My lord, for God's sake, be quick with the money. Otherwise, everything we have done up till now will have been to no avail."
fast construction was a huge drain on English revenue. As Edward's building programme forged ahead, his finances plunged into debt.
Every penny spent on Harlech Castle is recorded in the archives of the King's works. These archives show that Edward was spending huge sums, unprecedented sums, on his castle building campaign. With Harlech, for example, we know that cost him £9,500, or a third of his annual income.
The total cost of Edward's ring of castles was £80,000. It was the single greatest building project in the medieval world. The records also show us exactly how much people were paid, even Master James himself.
Here's a copy of the royal pay list, and this is a very, very fascinating document. It tells us who was being paid what by the crown. And here there's reference to an engineer, an architect, Master Jacobo, Master James, and he is being paid 8 shillings for 8 days' work, a shilling a day. That was a huge amount of money, revealing the high esteem in which James was held by the king.
And it's not only the grandees of the project who are detailed in the king's records, but, astonishingly, the names of labourers and masons are recorded from 700 years ago.
And here's reference to a chap called Adam Boynard, I suppose from Savoy. He's paid for delivering stone to the site. He's obviously not a mere cutter of stone, he's a manager. Now, another document throws yet more light on Adam Boynard. It dates from 1292, and here we see Adam mentioned again, Adam Boynard. He's gone up in the world, he's moving up through society. Now he's a bailiff of the town of Harlech. He's collecting rents. This is absolutely revealing. Clearly, by this time, Boynard was one of the trusted king's men, having risen in a few years from a mere mason to a chap running and administrating the new town.
It's incredibly rare for the identities and details of the common man to survive from the 13th century. So what sort of man was Boynard, and what sort of town was Harlech?
Well, in the 1290s, Harlech was very small, not very prosperous, and crouching below the great castle above it. And so this is where Boynard would have lived. One of these plots would have been his house. And of course he was an adventurer, part of a globe-trotting fraternity of masons, but he decided to put down roots here. He probably married a Welsh girl. I suppose they would have spoken in English, maybe French, not Welsh. He's a fascinating character. He's part of the English urban elite. He's one of the colonists that Edward hoped would transform Wales. They were part of Edward's master plan to anglicise this country.
Now, Edward's attack on Welshness stopped at nothing. He set about eradicating Welsh art and culture. And where better to start than with Estamgwan Hall, one of the prime palaces of his old enemy, Llywelyn, Prince of Wales. The palace was located in the heart of Llywelyn's territory, 5 miles along the coast from Harlech.
This is the site of Llywelyn's royal hall at S02.
This residence of the Welsh royal dynasty was to fall victim to Edward's determination to erase all things Welsh from the land of Wales.
When the English took it, they didn't burn it. Instead, on the orders of Edward, they dismantled it, stone by stone, timber by timber, and took it to Harlech. And it was here that Edward rebuilt Llywelyn's royal hall, on this site within the inner wall of the castle. So, this amazing building commemorating Welsh independence, this potential rallying place for Welsh freedom fighters, was robbed of its meaning, defiled and secured within the high walls of this English fortress.
By the mid-1290s, 7 of Edward's 8 castles were in place. The Ring of Stone was almost complete, and with it the dream of an independent Wales looked dead. More than a decade had passed since the death of Llywelyn, and Edward believed his grip on Wales was secure forever. Even the mere psychological impact of the castles appeared to be terrifying the Welsh into submission, without an arrow being fired. But Edward was in for a surprise. In the winter of 1294, the Welsh rose again in rebellion, angry about English taxation and lack of Welsh rights. And the leader of the heavy and sustained attack was none other than the distant cousin of Llywelyn, Marc ap Llywelyn. Preferring to avoid a full-on assault, Madoc mounted a sustained siege of the castle. There was no denying the English had been taken by surprise. The records show Harlech's garrison had been run down to a mere 20 men. The townspeople flocked to the castle to take refuge, and at the top of the list of men, women and children who entered from the town was the bailiff, Adam Boynar, anxious to save his skin along with the rest of them. The castle was surrounded by Madoc's men and entirely cut off from land.
This was the most dramatic test imaginable for Harlech Castle. Would this mighty and very expensive machine of war survive a siege? Would the thing work? This, of course, was a thought going through the minds of the people cowering here all those years ago in this very courtyard. Would they starve to death if food wasn't brought up from the coast? What would happen if the Welsh broke in, raped, mutilated, appalling stuff? And Adam Boynard, imagine his thoughts, fear for his own life, but also a sense of intense responsibility for everybody else.
Desperately undermanned, and with inadequate supplies, the genius of the castle faced its ultimate test. Just a few months into the siege, supplies from the town began to run out. 3 people died, and the rest waited desperately for help. Would Edward's masterstroke of building the castle on the coast save Harlech? Would supplies arrive by sea in time? In the spring of 1295, Edward's ships came to the rescue, sailing in from Ireland.
The fleet carrying troops and food got through in time, and the castle was saved. And consequently, Master James, Adam Boynar, and indeed Edward I were vindicated. The castle was invincible.
The might of the English king was preserved, and by late spring the Welsh revolt was over. Madoc ap Llywelyn was imprisoned in the Tower of London, where he remained until his death. Edward confirmed his iron grip on Wales by building one last castle in his chain of fortresses, the final link in the chain, on the island of Anglesey, Beaumaris Castle. But Edward never completed Beaumaris. And when Edward died in 1307, the great age of castle building was over. It had been an astonishing achievement, a triumph for the English, and a disaster for the Welsh. In its age, Harlech had remained invincible, the perfect fighting machine of its time. But there's a postscript to the history of Harlech Castle. A century later, Harlech fell, not through any structural weakness or even mighty military attack, but through human frailty, in a word, treachery. One last claimant to the Welsh throne, Owain Glyndŵr, bribed the dispirited and lonely English garrison to open the gates and was able to walk straight in. At last, the most feared English castle on Welsh soil had fallen into Welsh hands. Here, Glyndŵr set up a Welsh parliament in what would turn out to be Wales's very last bid for independence. But it would all prove a brief and hollow victory. Harlech's preeminence was over. The rules of the game had changed. This time the attacker, the future Henry V of England, brought with him explosives and firepower. With Harlech's fall, the age of the castle was dead.
When Harlech fell, it fell to new technology, to gunpowder and bombards. At a stroke, the old world was over, the new had arrived, and Harlech was obsolete. But its battles were not over. It now became the focus of a new battle, a battle over its meaning, its history. Was Harlech a symbol of English imperialism or of Welsh pride and independence? The castle sits between these two worlds, a brooding, enigmatic genius, meaning different things to different people.
In next week's programme, Hardwick Hall in Derbyshire, the most mysterious English country house ever built. The rich walls of Hardwick are steeped in treachery, lust for power and sexual intrigue. It is the battleground between the two most powerful women in the land and ultimately a fight for the crown of England itself.